What's the creepiest thing that's happened to you that you still wonder about to this day? Story 1. Worked as a night auditor at an old hotel, and around 2 in the morning, I received a phone call from the pool room, which was supposed to be closed, so I answered and only heard very heavy breathing before hanging up and checking the cameras where all the lights in the pool room were on. And when I walked down the hallway to see who was inside, the glass door was so cold that I could see my breath while the door was fogged over, and every light was off until I opened it, and the motion sensor light above me switched on. And as I looked around without seeing anything, another light came on across the pool, even though the room appeared empty. Then every light around the far side of the pool activated in a clear path, as if something invisible was walking toward me. So I ran out trembling and locked myself in my manager's office until sunrise, convincing myself that bugs must have triggered the sensors. But when I told my manager the story so he could laugh about it, he stopped smiling when I mentioned the phone call and asked if I was absolutely certain the caller identification showed the pool room. And when I confirmed it, he told me there had not been a phone in that room for 30 years. And when I checked, there truly was no phone at all, leaving me with an experience I still cannot rationalize even today. Story 2. Back in 1988, we were renting a refurbished house that was partly a log cabin from the 1700s. And one day, while I was in the bathroom, I heard 3 very loud knocks on the wall beneath the window. And when I looked outside, there was nothing. And about 30 seconds later, the knocks repeated with the same result. And later, when my wife and I planted flowers under that window, we found a concrete slab about 4 inches down and discovered that the bathroom had once been the entrance to the old log house, which felt incredibly unsettling since we had lived in that place for 3 years without ever hearing knocks before or after. And although we eventually built our own large log home and became familiar with the sounds logs make as they expand and contract, nothing we have ever heard has matched the distinct sound of someone knocking on a door like I heard that day. And even though I do not believe in ghosts or the supernatural, it remains an unexplained moment that happened only 2 feet from me. And years later, my wife reminded me of another strange incident involving fluorescent lights in the workshop where I was restoring a 1933 Mahler pipe organ with hundreds of pipes that we had rescued from a church in Batavia, Illinois. Because each time I brought a cleaned pipe from the garage to the workbench, one of the 3 fluorescent fixtures would randomly be dark, even though I never saw it switch on or off. And it never happened again in over 30 years. Which led my wife to believe that Christine Benson, the woman who originally funded the organ, was showing approval of the restoration while the completed organ became the central beloved feature of our home. Story 3. I live in a beach town and went to visit a friend who had just returned to her parents' home for the summer, and on my drive back, I chose the long route along the bay to enjoy the view of the stars and ship lights. But when I reached the road by the water, a thick spring fog had rolled in, making visibility terrible on the 25 miles per hour road, bordered by dunes on one side and houses on the other. And while driving slowly, I saw a figure rising from the dunes to my left and stepping toward the road. So I slammed my brakes, thinking it was someone crossing to a house. And although the shape resembled a woman in a long dress, I could not see a face. And when it reached the center of the road, the figure suddenly floated upward at an angle and vanished, even though there was no beach access path there, and no explanation makes sense for the way it moved. And I sat watching until it fully disappeared while feeling deeply shaken. And even 5 to 6 years later, I can remember exactly how it moved, as if it happened yesterday. Story. Years ago, my best friend and I were sitting in a cafe when we noticed a man watching us through a mirror across the room. And something about him felt so chilling and wrong that we both silently acknowledged it before leaving and joking nervously about it, even though we were only around 16. But about a week later, he came into my workplace and stared at me without looking away, while pretending to browse without any intention of buying. And when I told a coworker and walked off, I hoped it was nothing. Even though neither my friend nor I had ever seen him before, despite living our whole lives in that community. Yet a few weeks later, while we were in a completely different part of our large city at a store we rarely visited, the same man walked in the downstairs entrance, looked directly up at us on the second level, and left us horrified as we quickly left with our friends. And soon after, he returned to my workplace, causing my coworker and manager to react immediately because even they sensed something deeply unsettling about him without needing any explanation. And when I was sent upstairs to avoid him, he followed me until my manager intervened. But before he could be removed, the man looked directly at me and asked if he made me uncomfortable. And a wave of dread hit me so suddenly that I burst into tears, something that had never happened in my life. And after that moment, the store required someone to walk me to my car after late shifts because everyone agreed his presence was disturbingly wrong. And even 9 years later, my best friend and I still talk about the terrifying energy he radiated. Story 5. One night, the door to my room began slowly creaking open, moving about half an inch at a time, and each time I looked directly at it, the movement would stop. But when I glanced back at the book I was reading, and then looked again, the door had shifted just a little farther open, continuing this unsettling pattern until it had opened almost wide enough for someone to walk through. So in a shaky but as commanding a voice as I could manage, I said, "Stop it." And the door froze mid-creak in that more than 160 years old house where everything made noise. And I was honestly almost too scared to fall asleep because I knew for a fact that there was absolutely no one else in my family home that night. And another experience was something that happened throughout my childhood on the isolated farm where I grew up. A place surrounded by woods that came right up to one side of the barn and acres of fields stretching between us and the nearest neighbor. And every night when I finished my chores, turned off the barn light and closed the door behind me, the only illumination came from a dim porch light about 40 yards away and from the moon and stars if the sky was clear. And every single night I felt something watching me from around the corner of the barn. Something I somehow knew was perched about 10 feet off the ground with glowing red eyes, radiating a feeling of evil so strong that I would run to the house as quickly as I could, completely convinced it was right behind me, even though I never told anyone about it because my parents tended to dismiss anything like that. And I did not want to be called a crybaby, which is exactly what my father would have said. And eventually I convinced myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination, fueled by too many scary stories, until about 8 years later, when I was swapping spooky memories with my friend who had also spent her childhood on our farm. And she described feeling something tear, ifing staring at her from the exact same corner, at the same height with the same sense of red eyes, even though she had never seen anything. And my heart raced while she talked because it matched my own memories perfectly. And when I later cautiously asked my siblings without leading them, every single one of them described the exact same experience, saying that something frightening watched them from that same corner whenever they turned off the barn light. And even though I know we all grew up and outgrew those feelings, the strange part is how unlikely it seems that each of us felt the exact same thing in the exact same place for so many years. Story 6. That kind of thing used to happen to me in a room in the basement of my childhood home. A huge basement where only one room was finished for us to hang out in, while the rest looked like a dim attic filled with exposed support beams, thick cobwebs, and a decades-old furnace resting on uneven concrete. And my siblings and I spent countless hours in that finished room with a television and comfortable chairs set far inside the space, and the only doorway was positioned at the bottom of one of the two staircases leading upstairs. A staircase that always felt deeply unsettling because it creaked and crackled unpredictably and often gave each of us the sensation of being chased when we tried to go up it, while the other staircase could only be reached through the dark, unfinished side of the basement that was barely lit even on bright days and pitch black the rest of the time, with light switches and pull cords placed at awkward points designed to be turned on only while coming down from the kitchen, not from the finished room. And each of us as children felt watched by something lurking in the corner near the exit. Something that seemed to have red eyes set unnaturally high up, even though the ceiling was lower than 10 feet, giving me the impression that whatever it was spent most of its time crouching in that shadowy corner. And later in life, when I carefully asked my siblings without giving them any clues, I discovered that each of them had experienced similar frightening encounters, including my own memory from when I was about 5 years old and woke up in the middle of the night unexpectedly seated in one of the basement chairs far too close to the old television, a heavy CRT model with a column of analog buttons, which were pressed in a way that made the screen blast an overwhelming stream of loud static that filled the finished room with flickering white and gray light. And the rest of the basement behind me was pitch dark because I had apparently Walked there and positioned myself without turning anything on. Something that made no sense since I did not even know sleepwalking existed at the time. And worse still, I immediately felt the familiar presence of that thing watching me from the corner while I sat frozen and silent with adrenaline pounding in my veins as the television roared louder than my heartbeat. And a chilling realization settled over me that no one knew I was there. No one could possibly hear me, and no one would be coming until morning because the television was too loud and my voice too small. And eventually I gathered every ounce of courage and ran directly past the corner and up the stairs, flipping the light switch as I went and feeling the overwhelming sense of being followed. Though I do not actually remember running through the rest of the house or climbing into my bed, and I do not recall my parents reacting the next morning, even though they surely found the basement light on and the television still blasting static. And to this day, I genuinely do not know what happened or how I ended up there. But I have never been convinced it was a simple, ordinary explanation. Story 7. I was probably around 6 or 7 years old in Turin, Italy, and my mother, my sister, and I were at the train station preparing to visit friends in Rome. And my mother wanted to call her friend to let her know that our train would be a few hours late, which is extremely common there even today. So she brought us to a payphone and told my sister to hold her hand while she kept an eye on the suitcases. And I was supposed to hold my sister's hand. But as my mother was making the call, a tall man suddenly grabbed my hand and began walking, or more accurately pulling, me away from my sister while asking me strange questions about whether I had many friends at school. And I was too shocked, too young, and too naive to understand what was happening as panic began to rise inside me. Yet for some reason, I focused on answering his questions while he continued leading me toward the main entrance of the station until, just a few feet from the exit, my other hand was suddenly grabbed by my mother, and I heard her let out a scream louder than anything I had ever heard in my life. And the man bolted away faster than I believed anyone could run, as I stood there frozen, watching him disappear, while my mother cried and begged for forgiveness and hugged me tighter than she ever had before. And when I turned, I saw my sister pointing her small finger at me, with tears streaming down her face, mouthing my name over and over again, even though she probably could not speak at that moment. And I still do not know whether she saved my life that day or where I might have ended up if I had left the station with that man. But I know I owe her everything. And as for my mother, after that moment, she always waited for me to release a hug first, because she never again let go before I did. And even though I can no longer see her now, I hope she somehow knows that I always loved her and always will. Story 8. One afternoon I was upstairs in the bathroom, sitting on the old porcelain throne and minding my own business in the most vulnerable position a person can be in. And a few feet across from me stood a tall metal towel rack where I kept a flashlight with a magnet attached because I lived in a very rural and isolated town where, for many years, the power grid was unreliable due to wind, rain, and aging transformers that flickered, failed, or even exploded until they were finally replaced over the last 5 years. But on that particular day, while I was alone in the house, the flashlight suddenly launched itself off the rack and fell at my feet. And I want to be clear that it did not simply drop, because I watched it arc through the air in a way that falling objects normally do not. And there were no strange voices, no shadows drifting through the room, no banging pots or swinging doors like in the stereotypical tales of rural hauntings. Just absolute silence as I sat there frozen and waiting for something, anything else to happen. And after a long moment, I managed to finish what I was doing, picked up the flashlight, placed it back on the stand, and went downstairs, although I am slightly embarrassed to admit that I kept expecting to hear footsteps following me. But nothing happened, and that was years ago, and it has never happened since. And I truly have no explanation for it. And while I cannot prove the event or convince anyone that I am not making it up, all I can do is tell it the way it happened and still wonder how something like that could occur while I was just sitting there in total solitude. Story 9. I think I may have stepped into a parallel dimension once when my mom asked me to return a movie, which I remember clearly was the one with the blue aliens, to the red box across the street from my high school, and I decided to explore and look for an alternate route home instead of cutting through the neighborhood behind the school like I normally did. And while walking along the main road, I noticed a neighborhood where there definitely had not been one before, But because new neighborhoods were constantly being built in the area, I assumed it was just another recent development and turned in to explore since I enjoy looking at beautiful houses. And right when I stepped in, everything around me dimmed, as if clouds suddenly covered the sun, despite the sky being perfectly clear. And what struck me as truly strange was how every single house design matched exactly. The same two-story layout, the same dark green paint, the same perfectly manicured lawn, without any variation in color or structure the way normal neighborhoods have. And there were no cars parked on the streets at all, and it was so quiet that I could not even hear the freeway I knew was nearby. And the whole place felt surreal and wrong, like something out of a movie, until it unnerved me so much that I decided to leave. And as soon as I stepped out of the neighborhood, everything brightened back to normal. So I backtracked to my usual route and told my younger brother about the experience, even though we never ended up going back. And now that I am an adult, I have tried multiple times to find that neighborhood by driving around the area. But the neighborhood that exists there today looks nothing like what I saw. And I have searched on maps and still cannot find anything resembling the place I walked into that day. Story 10. The creepiest thing that ever happened to me, something I still cannot explain, occurred back in 2013 when I was 13 years old. And it was early afternoon when my parents decided to go to the store for some reason. And before leaving, my mom told me to take a few things out to the camper, which I agreed to do before going back to watching urban legends on YouTube. And once I was alone with the dogs, I looked out the window at the neighbors because they had been using loud tools. And I waved when they saw me and they waved back. But about 20 minutes later, the noise stopped, and when I looked outside again toward the small wooded area, I saw this large figure with unnaturally skinny legs hopping around and staring directly at me. And although it did not look human, it was moving erratically and ducking in a way that made it clear it was aware of me, even with the blinds partially closed. And I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, but absolutely could not. And I still had to take the items to the camper, so I gathered everything in my hands, ran outside, dropped the things inside as quickly as possible, and when I came back out, the creature was still there, behaving just as strangely. And I called out my neighbor's name but heard no response, only the frantic movements of the thing I was looking at. And as my fear grew, I ran inside, locked all the doors, gathered a Bible, a rosary, and all of my dogs, and called my parents crying while telling them what was happening. And as usual, they told me I was being ridiculous and said they were already down the street. And when they arrived, I looked outside again and saw the neighbor calmly trimming trees in the very same wooded patch where that creature had stood just minutes earlier. And to this day, I have absolutely no idea what I saw and have never seen anything like it again. Story 11. I have several occurrences that began when I was young and slowly tapered off as I got older, and I will try to recall them in order, beginning when I was 12 years old and was looking at a picture of a girl hanging on my mom's wall before falling asleep beside her while she read a book. And shortly after drifting off, I began to see the girl's face vividly in my mind until her eyes came sharply into focus, and I suddenly heard a loud snapping noise inside my head. And immediately afterwards, I found myself completely paralyzed, awake, and trying desperately to call out to my mom, who was still beside me reading, and completely unaware that I was lying there, terrified and unable to move. And this kind of paralysis began happening frequently. And by the time I was 16, it occurred one night in my own bed, with far greater intensity along with a rhythmic whooshing sound that always accompanied these episodes and grew stronger whenever I tried to regain control of my body. And over the years, I had formed a habit of trying to break free, starting with my fingers, then my hands, and then the rest of me. But on this particular night, as the whooshing intensified, a horrible voice began speaking in time, with a rhythm saying something along the lines of, "You will do as he says." And it was so sinister and horrifying that after years of being terrified simply by the paralysis itself, I was overwhelmed by the sudden feeling that something malevolent was trying to take control of me. And I fought with everything I had until I broke free, ran to my mother's room in complete panic, and woke her up only to be met with anger and blame instead of comfort. But the experiences continued, and later that same year I fell asleep on the sofa in the living room and woke up paralyzed again without knowing how much time had passed. And this time I closed my eyes trying to ride it out until seconds later, I felt as if I were rushing upward at incredible speed. And when I panicked, Kicked and opened my eyes, I found myself floating only a hand's length from the ceiling, fully awake and aware. And when I turned, I saw my own body lying peacefully on the sofa below me. And I must mention that among my three older sisters and myself, we had all experienced unsettling things in that house that convinced us it was not normal, with two rooms standing out as especially disturbing, and each of us believing that two different presences occupied the home for reasons we never fully understood. Story 12. I had a Doberman named Zeus since I was little, as my parents got him not long after I was born, and he became my best friend who followed me everywhere. But around 8th grade, he developed a serious tumor along with a snake bite to the face, and although the snake bite eventually healed, the tumor became multiple tumors and he had to be put down soon afterward. And years later, my dad was sitting downstairs watching television when he heard a dog running down the stairs and looked up to see Zeus peeking through the railing, before turning and running back up the steps the way he used to do when checking on us. And once when I was sitting on my bed, working on something, I looked up from my laptop and saw Zeus standing in my doorway, wagging his little nub before walking off. And both my dad and I used to see him frequently, even though it has been a while now. Yet I still occasionally see shadows under my door, as if he is walking around. And another experience still shocks me because my middle school held a yearly festival called Carnival on the campus grounds. And since it was a Catholic school, there was always an unlocked church on site for anyone who wanted to go in and pray. And one night during the event, my boyfriend and one of his friends wanted to explore the church. And while they wandered around completely creeped out, I walked into the main area with the aisles leading to the altar and froze when I saw someone sitting there. And then I recognized the blue overalls, the glasses, and the pen in his pocket. Because sitting in the pew where my family always sat was my grandpa, who had passed away 3 or 4 years earlier. Story 13. When my parents divorced, I moved from the city to a small rural town when I was 12, and I often went to the arcade with a kid I befriended because $5 gave us endless games, and the owner usually fed us dinner with a hot dog and a drink. And although his slightly run-down house overlooked the town's train yard in a way that seems strange in hindsight, I stayed the night there once in his attic bedroom on the 3rd floor, with a low ceiling and a small window where you could see the entire yard and all the long trains slowly coming and going. But right before we went to sleep, I casually looked out the window and saw no trains at all across the dozens of tracks, only the silhouette of a man standing alone in the middle of the yard. And even though it was too dark and too far to see his face, I felt with absolute certainty that he was staring directly at me. And something about him felt wrong in a way I still cannot describe. And even though I was sure he could not see me in the dark attic, he remained completely still for what felt like forever, until I finally woke my friend. And when we both looked out again, the man was gone. And the memory is like a frozen image in my mind, even though I can no longer remember my friend's name, how I met him, what my school looked like, or much about that town at all. Yet I still remember the train yard, and I still remember that man. Story 14. I did not want a cat because I considered myself a dog person and already had a dog, but my stepbrother began feeding a stray that lingered around our condo, and when he moved out, he left the cat behind, and the cat and I became close companions through 3 moves before settling into the home where my wife and her 2 older cats lived. And after they passed peacefully and I buried them in the yard, it was just the cat, my wife, me, and my deceased mother's old Chihuahua. And although we lived in a quiet neighborhood in southern Florida, the cat began developing a strange cough that worsened. And the vet eventually told me they could not help him and that he would only continue to suffer. But I could not bring myself to put him down because he still seemed active and happy, even as his breathing became strained. And eventually the day came when he struggled badly, and I made the heartbreaking appointment as it grew dark. And I took him to a favorite spot in the backyard with a couple of shots of whiskey to steady myself as we said goodbye. When suddenly he jumped up and ran off, and my wife and I searched everywhere, but could not find him. And 2 hours later, while I was still searching, she called to say a strange cat was at the front door, trying to get in, even though we had never seen another cat in the neighborhood. And when I walked back toward the house, I found my cat lying calmly in a little nest of leaves in the flower bed. And as I picked him up, my wife came from the back door shouting that another strange cat was now clawing at the back door, trying to enter, even though to reach that door, it would have had to pass through multiple enclosed areas, including the pool room and the Florida room. And as I walked past it, holding my cat, the strange cat watched silently. And when I went back outside, I saw several other cats surrounding the yard at a distance watching us. And my wife and I, both calm and logical people in our 40s, were completely unsettled as the cats continued scratching and making strange noises while my cat struggled on the couch. And after a long night, we eventually fell asleep. And at 4 in the morning, I woke up to find him curled in my closet, barely hanging on. And after letting my wife say goodbye, I took him to the emergency vet around 5:30, where he passed peacefully in my arms. And when I returned home, all the strange cats had disappeared, and we buried him in the flower bed where he had chosen to rest. And a few days later, when I mentioned his passing to my neighbor, her husband said he had also seen the sudden gathering of cats that night, and their indoor cat had acted strangely, as if trying to get outside. And although I have been with many animals and several people at the end of life, I have never experienced anything as eerie or unexplainable as the night the cats gathered. Story 15. I worked on the grounds of a historic property, the old governor's mansion in Virginia, when I was younger, and although the main 10,000 square feet house was creepy in countless ways, the real weirdness took place in the worker housing where one of my buddies lived. And sometimes during lunch we would go over so he could nap while I relaxed on the couch. And one day while I was passed out, I woke up to the sound of what absolutely resembled chains dragging beneath the living room floor, not loud but unmistakably coming from a specific spot, even though there was nothing under the house that could have caused it. And the moment I moved, the sound stopped instantly, and I never heard it again. But when I asked my buddy about it, he reacted like I had guessed something impossibly specific and asked if I had really heard the chains, then explained that he had heard the same sound from the same spot for years, usually early in the morning when he was asleep on the couch. And it always woke him up and always stopped the second he became fully alert. And he assumed it was something only he heard, possibly sleep-related, but my hearing it terrified him. And over the years, he would occasionally mention hearing the chains again, sometimes weeks apart and sometimes months. Always the same sound from the same place disappearing the moment he stood up. And I would joke about them coming for him, but nothing else ever happened until one day something truly unexplainable occurred. Because that morning, he'd heard the chains right before getting up to come into work and had been annoyed because he lost sleep after staying up too late. And when we planned to go to his place for lunch so he could nap and I could cook, we walked through the door and found his cat dead in the exact same spot on the living room floor where the chain sounds always came from. And the cat was healthy, around 5 years old, with no visible injuries. And when he took it to the vet, they couldn't determine the cause without an autopsy, which he declined. And he had the cat cremated and placed the urn on a shelf in the living room. And from that day forward until he moved out nearly 5 years later, he never heard the chain noises again, even though they had happened every few weeks for 3 or 4 years. And once the cat died, the activity completely stopped, leaving us with no explanation whatsoever for what we had experienced and making it the strangest thing that has ever happened to me. Story 16. It was 2016, and I was 18 years old working as an au pair in Rome for the first time traveling abroad alone. And I am Asian American, which matters for the story. And the first time I encountered him, I was riding the commuter train to an evening event downtown when he sat beside me and struck up conversation. Appearing to be in his early 30s, well-mannered, clean-shaven, and seemingly ordinary as he talked about being a native Roman with generations of family history in the city. And when he got off, he asked for my number, but I only took his without giving mine. And right as he left, he said casually, "You seem very young. Are you 20?" Which immediately set off alarms in my mind, even though I did not fully understand why. And I chose not to contact him. But about a month later, without having reached out at all, I saw him again during a crowded weekend when I was sitting in a very busy piazza with hundreds of people around. And despite the crowd, he walked directly to the monument I was sitting on and sat right beside me without recognizing me. Then began talking to the Asian woman on his other side and told her a completely different story about being from Milan on a business trip before asking for her number and repeating the exact same phrase, "You seem very young. Are you 20?" Mafui, and when she refused and her male friend arrived, he left quickly. And 2 weeks later, I saw him again, even though I had never initiated any contact as I sat in Piazza Venezia on a quiet weekday. And he appeared walking directly toward me while speaking angrily on the phone before sitting about 10 feet from me and looking over in a way that made it clear he recognized me. And I got up and left with my heart racing. And when I turned back a minute later, he was gone. And I left Rome 2 days after that, never seeing him again. But I have always felt that something sinister was behind these encounters, and I cannot shake the belief that he may have been targeting young Asian women for something dangerous. So I share this as a warning for everyone, especially young women, to remain aware of their surroundings because you never truly know who you may be talking to. Story 17. When I was around 12 years old, I was left home alone one evening because my mom was at work and my dad and brother were down the street at a neighbor's house. And since we lived in what was considered a safe neighborhood and my dad was nearby, it felt no big deal to be alone. So I decided to take a shower with the bathroom door open. And while I was washing, I heard the sound of someone coming through the front door and thought nothing of it, assuming my dad had come home. And even when I heard drawers being rummaged through in my parents' bedroom, I still did not think much of it. So as I was nearly finished, I called out, "Dad, can you shut the door?" Hoping for a bit of privacy, but no one answered. And suddenly an overwhelming wave of terror hit me out of nowhere. So I hurried to finish and turned off the water. And as I was reaching for my towel, I noticed a human shadow on the other side of the mostly opaque, slightly translucent shower curtain, and I froze completely, standing silently as my senses sharpened while I tried to process what was happening. And then the floor creaked as the shadow slowly moved toward me. In a small gap opened between the curtain and the wall where a stranger's face suddenly appeared staring in at me. And I stood motionless, making eye contact with this intruder. Terrified, my instincts so scrambled that instead of covering myself, I remember covering my chest, and we both stayed silent until he backed up and left the bathroom, closing the door behind him, though I never heard him leave the house. And I stayed in the shower stall for a long time before finally mustering enough courage to step out, grab the house phone from my parents' bedroom, and call my dad at the neighbors to tell him what had happened. And he rushed home to search the entire house, but found no signs of a break-in and nothing missing. And he accused me of imagining it, even though I knew what I saw. And sometime later, my parents took my brother and me to a Christmas party at the local Slovak club, where, as the night went on, the man from the bathroom walked up to our table, shook my dad's hand, and started making small talk. And I was in complete shock realizing he was one of my dad's bar acquaintances. And when he walked away, I told my dad who he was. But my dad, who had been drinking, mocked me and then actually called the man back over to retell the story and introduced me to him, while the creep laughed and made unsettling comments before giving me a look that clearly said I should stay quiet. And afterward, I begged my dad to believe me, but he did not, though my mom said she believed me, even though neither of them acted on it. And years later, when I brought up the memory again as an adult, my dad froze because he had forgotten the entire incident until I reminded him. And then he told me the man had recently been jailed for breaking and entering, confirming everything I had always known was real. Story 18. When I was nearly kidnapped at 13 years old, along with my friend, both of us small and underdeveloped enough that we easily looked around 11, we were walking from the community pool back to her house wearing normal clothes because we had already changed out of our swimsuits, and the walk was about half a mile along a semi-busy two-lane road, with her neighborhood entrance nearby, as well as a field with dense woods, a few houses, and other neighborhood entrances on the way. And we were walking on the left side of the road facing traffic when a van passed us heading in the opposite direction. And moments later, the same van was behind us on our side of the road, going the same direction we were walking, meaning it had turned around to approach us again. And although at first I assumed the driver had simply missed a turn, I felt a terrible dread rising even before the van came alongside us. And the scruffy man driving rolled down his window and politely asked where we were going. And although we kept walking, I instinctively said we were meeting my dad at the next house, hoping it would deter him, and he hesitated before asking if he could give us a ride. But I said no. And at that moment, another car approached behind the van, forcing the van to move or draw attention. Yet the van lingered just long enough for the rear door to suddenly slide open violently, revealing a second man hidden inside who shouted for us to get into the van. And right then, the car behind them honked loudly. And as I looked back, I must have appeared terrified because the driver of that car got out and asked what was happening, though I did not trust them either in that moment. And I took their interruption as our one chance to escape, grabbing my friend's wrist and running full speed into the field. And as soon as we bolted, the man in the van sped into a nearby neighborhood on his side of the road, and my friend, knowing the area, led us through a shortcut in the woods, into a neighborhood where we could cut through yards to reach her home without returning to the main road. And we ran the entire way despite branches and bushes slowing us down. And when we finally made it into her house, we kept repeating, "What just happened? We are so lucky to be alive," before hugging and watching Scrubs on DVD to calm ourselves. And when her mom arrived, she immediately noticed we were scratched and dirty. And after hearing what happened, she called her police friend, who later told us they had found two men matching the description in a very specific type of van, though we never asked for details afterward because we just wanted to forget. But I have never forgotten how close we came to disappearing that day around 2006. Story 19. When I was around 12 years old, a few neighborhood friends and I decided we would try a seance. Nothing serious because we were young and clueless. So in the middle of the day, we turned off all the lights in my friend's bedroom and started asking the typical dramatic questions like, "Spirits, if you are here, give us a sign." And nothing happened. And then, "Spirits, if you are here, make a noise." And still nothing. And after about 10 minutes of repeating variations of the same questions, the last thing we asked was, "Spirits, if you are here, turn on the computer." And at that exact moment, the house phone rang, which made all of us scream before laughing about the timing. And about 2 minutes later, my friend's mom ran upstairs and told me I needed to take the call in her bedroom. And she held my hand while I talked to my mom, who told me she was coming to get me because my uncle had just attempted to take his own life, but survived. And I panicked and ran out crying until my mom picked me up and we went to the hospital. And to this day, more than 25 years later, my uncle still swears he was not suicidal, had never been depressed, and has no explanation for how it happened, saying he had been cleaning things in the basement of my great-grandmother's house where he lived at the time, and found a gun that had belonged to his father, loaded, and said he completely blanked out after picking it up until the moment it fired. And he said he put it in his mouth and pulled the trigger, and it did not go off, then put it to his temple, and again it did not fire, and then pulled it away from his head and shot it into the air where it finally discharged. And only then did he snap out of whatever state he was in and realize what he was doing. And he called the ambulance himself and checked in for help because he could not explain where the feeling came from or why he acted the way he did. And I still believe that something sinister and unseen was connected to that seance and somehow manifested through him after we foolishly asked for things we did not understand. Story 20. My family has lived in the same house since I was 4 years old, a house built in 1907. And while many people claim their homes are haunted, we are absolutely certain ours is, to the point that even my dad, the most skeptical person imaginable, has become a believer. And although listing everything would take 10 pages, the major events include objects moving by themselves, the stove turning on right in front of us multiple times, a table in the entryway that never stays where it is placed, doors opening and closing on their own, constant footsteps on the stairs daily, the upstairs bathroom faucets turning on by themselves, even though we have never witnessed it happening. And during a time my bathroom was being remodeled, I used the one bathroom without an exhaust fan and came out of the shower to find a shoe drawn perfectly in the fogged mirror, along with endless strange noises from the basement. And over the years, almost every person who has ever spent the night at our house has left believing in ghosts regardless of their beliefs beforehand, with multiple friends leaving in the middle of the night as teenagers because the house terrified them. But my parents love the house so much that they refuse to move after all the work they have put into restoring it. And although nothing has ever harmed us and the ghosts do not feel malicious, I had never actually seen an apparition until the other night, and neither had anyone in my family, even with all the strange activity. And it happened when I was sitting on my bed on the top floor across from my twin brother's room around 11 at night when I heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up expecting no one because there never is. But a boy walked straight into my room physically, solidly, in full detail, and because I have two brothers on the second floor, one 15 and one the other triplet, I assumed he was one of their friends and got freaked out that he would walk into my room. So late, and he stood in the middle of the room several feet away looking confused. So I ran past him and into my brother's room saying there was a boy acting strange in my room. But my brother said he had no friend over, and when we rushed back he was gone. And after checking the closet, under the bed, and even the balcony, which was double locked and would have creaked loudly if opened, we found no trace of anyone. And after asking my other brothers if they had friends over and waking up my parents, my dad and brothers searched the entire house while me and my mom waited outside, and they found nothing and no unlocked doors. And even the police who arrived found nothing and told me I must have been dreaming. But I know I was awake, and after everything that has happened, we are almost certain the boy was a ghost. Story 21. Years ago, when my dad was working during harvest season, I was watched by my sitter for the weekend, and she did not have her car because it was in the shop. So we walked more than a mile downtown to retrieve it, but accidentally passed the repair shop and ended up at an auto parts store before turning back the other way. And I was around 6 years old with long hair because my dad loved heavy metal, and I was wearing sweats because it was cold. And although that day seemed completely ordinary, something happened 15 years later when I was sitting in my pickup truck at that exact same auto parts store and saw an older woman walking with a boy around 6 years old who looked exactly like me at that age with the same long hair, the same face, and even the same outfit. And to my shock, the woman was unmistakably my sitter, even though she had passed away around 8 years after that childhood day. And it felt as if for a brief moment the past and present had collided, and those 2 points in time brushed against each other. And although someone could argue it was just a resemblance, I felt an eerie chill through my spine and genuinely wanted to get out and say hello, but something kept me from approaching them, as if the universe would not allow interference with the past. And they walked the same way and repeated the exact movements I remembered before disappearing. And by the time I stepped out to look again, they were gone without a trace. And the whole experience reminded me of an episode of The Twilight Zone, where a pioneer in search of water falls through time into a diner in the 1950s. And even though I do not expect people to believe me, I swear this happened exactly as I remember. Strangely mundane, yet completely unforgettable. And I have thought about it ever since. Story 22. When I was 15, I was watching television until I felt ready to sleep. And after turning it off and settling into my blanket, I heard scratching behind the headboard of my bed, like mice moving through the walls. Loud enough that I could not fall asleep. So I knocked on the wall and the noise disappeared for a couple of minutes before starting again. And this went on for what felt like 30 minutes until I heard a cracking sound, like wood breaking. And when I looked to the top left corner of my room, I saw a figure crawling out from inside the wall toward me, exactly like the creature from the movie The Frighteners, which sent chills through my entire body. And I jumped out of bed, turned on the lights, and the figure vanished while the room became silent. So I stayed awake for an hour, telling myself I must have imagined it before trying to sleep again. But as soon as the same noises started, I immediately turned the lights back on and then did not sleep for the next 2 days. And the only explanation I could think of was that I had taken a fossilized Native American pendant from the creek behind my neighborhood and kept it in my room. And although other strange things happened after that, this was the moment that finally made me return the pendant to the creek. And ever since then, I have never been bothered again. Story 23. When I was around 10 years old, I went for a walk down River Street in Savannah at night with my sister and my dad. And after visiting a few shops, we reached an old hotel that my dad claimed was haunted, which my sister and I believed was just him trying to scare us. But because I loved anything spooky, I begged to go inside. And while my sister refused and waited outside, my dad and I took the elevator up and decided to race back to the entrance, splitting up immediately. But the hotel interior was like a maze with every hallway identical. The same wallpaper, the same console tables, the same paintings, and after running around, I realized I was lost and could not retrace my steps. And that was when I heard my sister's voice calling my name, sounding irritated as if I had taken too long. And feeling relieved, I ran toward the sound. But no matter how much I followed her voice, I never got closer. And each turn only led to another identical hallway, and an overwhelming sense came over me that I was being lured. So I trusted my instincts and ran the opposite direction until I finally found the elevator and got out. And when I stepped outside, my dad and sister were already there sitting by the entrance. And when I asked how my sister got out before me, she said she had never gone inside at all. And when I told them what happened, my dad only laughed and reminded us. He said the place was haunted while my sister and I were shaken. And she said this was exactly why she did not mess around with spirits. And I still think about that night even now. Story 24. I had a mysterious but heartwarming experience that still has no explanation other than feeling like a message from somewhere beyond. Because my grandpa was a brilliant but very serious man who never showed emotion no matter how heartfelt you were with him. And while he was being treated for lung cancer, we planned to visit him, but the hospital went into lockdown due to a virus. And 2 days later, I received the call that he had passed away without us getting to see him one last time. And in our tradition, the whole family gathers to mourn together. So on my way home, I bought a bottle of whiskey for the gathering and a can of cola for myself, even though I was not much of a drinker. And while everyone was drinking heavily and sharing stories, I sat there wishing I had told my grandpa how much he meant to me while he was alive. And eventually I got up to grab the cola from the refrigerator door shelf where I had placed it, only to find it missing. And after looking through the fridge, the kitchen, and even the trash with no sign of it, I told my family and no one knew anything about it. So I checked the fridge again, and suddenly the can was hidden behind bowls on the top shelf where we never put drinks because they freeze there. And the bowls had clearly been there since the previous day. And when I asked if anyone moved it, they all said no. So I opened it, drank it, and returned to the group. And when I finished the can, it had the words, "I love you," printed on the side, which was not shocking because back in 2015, many cans had messages. But later I found my receipt and saw only the whiskey listed with no cola, which made everything feel strange. So the next day I went back to the shop to pay for the cola in case they forgot to charge me. And the owner said she did not remember me buying one, but appreciated the honesty. And before leaving, I checked the cola cans on the shelf, expecting to find ones with messages. But every single can was plain. And the shopkeeper told me they had stopped selling the message cans months earlier. And when I rushed home to check the trash, every bin was empty of that can, even though I had thrown it out. And that was when I understood the message and finally let myself shed a tear and say, "I love you too, old man." Story 25. When I was around 13 or 14, I went to hang out with my friend in a town next to where we lived. And since we lived in an area that felt extremely safe, we walked there and back because it was only about 15 minutes. But by the time we were heading back to her house, it was dark, and a pickup truck drove past us, slowing down slightly as it went by. And although we did not think much of it at first because nothing bad had ever happened in our neighborhood, the same truck passed again, going the opposite direction. Then again, and again. And by the second time, we were uneasy, but by the fourth time, we were very nervous. And then the truck stopped on the corner of the road about 100 feet in front of us, sat there for a moment, and finally drove away. So we started running as soon as it disappeared. And when we reached the corner and looked down the road, it had turned on too. We saw it coming back toward the main road because it had distinctive lights on the top. And even though we could already see her house, we did not want the driver to know where any of us lived. So we ducked behind a trailer in a small gravel parking lot a few buildings away from her place. And after the truck drove by again, we sprinted toward her house the second we felt unseen, running into her backyard, waiting one more time for the truck to pass, which it did, and then rushing inside through the side door. And although it was scary in the moment, now that I am older and watch a lot of true crime, the entire situation feels deeply unsettling because I still have no idea who the driver was or what they wanted. And I have never seen that truck again. But I am grateful we were alert enough to notice and close enough to her house when it happened, because I honestly do not want to imagine what could have happened if we had turned down a darker street. Story 26. I think I am a bit late to this, but here it goes because I met my best friend when we were in primary school. And after 2 years, he had to move to France with his family since his mother was originally from there. And life would be better for his little sister who had a medical condition. Yet we always stayed best friends and cared very deeply about each other, even though we only saw one another during vacations. And 4 years ago in summer, he came back to the place where he used to live and where I still lived in a Balkan country. And I was always thrilled to see him. And although we went to the beach that first day, the part I remember is when we went to a small fast food place we always used to visit because he missed the food. And since I had forgotten my money, I asked him to pay for mine. And he had 10 euros and the meal cost 5. So he took his 5 euros change and we walked while eating before heading for a drink. But when we reached the village square, he realized he had lost the change. So I told him I would go back to look for it and be right back. And when I returned to the fast food place, there were some kids outside who told me that someone had found the money and was inside. So I went in, found the guy, asked for the 5 euros. He held it up and asked if it was mine. I said yes, and I left. And then I walked back to meet my friend, but he was nowhere. And after searching, I went home to see if he might have gone there. And when my parents said they had not seen him, I went to my room and messaged him asking where he was because I had been looking everywhere. And 7 minutes later, he replied saying, I must have messaged the wrong person, which made no sense. So I called him on video, and he answered wearing a different shirt, and slowly I understood he was actually in France, and he kept showing proof that he had never been here. And when the truth hit me, I felt something inside me collapse because I knew I had just spent the whole day with someone who looked and acted exactly like him, and yet he had never been in the country. And when I hung up, I could not stop crying because it felt like the world had tilted, and I am not someone who cries easily. Maybe 4 or 5 times my whole life. But even now, whenever I think about it, I start crying again. And I did not tell anyone else because my family never believes in anything unusual, and I knew it had really happened. And even the kids at the fast food place confirmed I was looking for the money, and I still have no explanation, no theories, just the same cold wave of goosebumps every time I remember it. Story 27. I worked nights in a pediatric intensive care unit that had its own freight elevator in the back near the doctor's offices, and no one used it except the doctors, and no one could access it without a specific card key. And the doctors were never there at night unless a major emergency happened. And since we usually only had around 4 children with 2 or 3 nurses, it was a small unit. And that night it was just me and another nurse with only 2 patients after an exhausting day shift that involved several critical transfers and 1 child who passed away. So the shift report was short, but the day nurses were emotionally destroyed with used supplies scattered everywhere. And even though they normally cleaned their own mess, we told them to clock out so we would handle it. And after the last doctor finished a phone call with a receiving facility, he left through the freight elevator, and we turned off most lights as part of the night routine, including the back hallway, the doctor's offices, and the elevator area. And after assessing our patients, restocking crash carts, and cleaning the unit, we were playing Phase 10 at the nurse's station when we suddenly heard the freight elevator ding even though no one was there. And we brushed it off as an old elevator being cranky. But around 2 in the morning, when I was restocking oxygen tubing, I heard the ding again, much closer. And when nothing happened, I kept working until suddenly all the lights in the doctor's office turned on. And thinking a doctor had arrived to prepare for an emergency, I hurried in but found no one. And as I turned to leave, I heard papers shuffling and saw that a table that had been clean earlier was suddenly covered with documents. And when I checked, I found it was the original chart of one of the children transferred earlier, even though we had used it, closed it, and sent it to medical records at the start of our shift. And although the other nurse dismissed it, we left a message for our medical records since they would not return until 7 in the morning, and we brought the chart to the nurse's station to organize it for resending. And while we worked, the phone rang, and it was the receiving hospital needing allergy information because part of the chart was missing on their end, which made my skin crawl because I was holding the original in my hands. And after I gave them the allergies, I told my coworker I needed a smoke break. And right then, the doctor's office lights turned off, and the freight elevator doors opened and closed with a ding, and even the skeptical nurse went pale. So I was in the smoking area within 5 minutes. And although people always joked about ghosts of former doctors haunting the unit or the elevator, no one had ever described anything like what we saw. And the next morning, medical records confirmed they had received the chart through the pneumatic tube system, but had no record of receiving the physical copy at all. And although the hospital was old with plenty of electrical issues, nothing explained what happened that night. Story 28. I was in the hospital after a coworker hammered a nail straight through a board and into my hand, and the nail went completely through my palm, so they kept me on intravenous antibiotics for 4 days with my hand strapped to an intravenous stand to keep it elevated, and it hurt terribly, so they had me on strong painkillers that made me woozy and disoriented. And in the middle of the night, I woke up to an old man calling out for Karen, saying he just needed his wife Karen to come to him, sounding so sad and desperate that after a while I buzzed the nurse and asked if they could help the old man, who sounded so upset. And she said they were trying, and turned on my television to drown out the noise. And throughout the night, during vital checks, I kept hearing him. And later, when they gave me more pain medication, I started hearing different voices in the hallway. And around 3 in the morning, I woke up and saw someone standing at the window. And when I asked who he was, he turned and said he must have wandered into the wrong room, introduced himself as Henry, and said he was waiting for his wife to pick him up. And when I asked if his wife was named Karen and told him I had heard him calling out the previous nights, he said I was probably right about her coming in the morning, and then walked out. And I fell asleep again until the nurse woke me for vitals at 5 in the morning, and we talked a bit. And I asked if Henry ever found his room and told her it was reassuring he was going home because of how distraught he had sounded. And later the doctor came in asking me to describe Henry and whether I had really told the nurse he was fully dressed at 3 in the morning. And that evening I had a new night nurse who was friendly. And when I woke up again, hearing voices in the hall, I buzzed her asking for juice, and she offered to help me walk. So she adjusted my intravenous line, and we went into the hallway where there was no one, which unnerved me. And bam. Kai in my room, she told me she was actually a doctor studying people she called antennas, patients usually on strong painkillers who picked up on something. And she told me that Henry was a real patient whose wife Karen had died in a car accident and who had called for her repeatedly during his stay until he passed away after a few days. And she said my description of him was extremely accurate, even though he had been gone for weeks, and that she had documented many cases over the years of patients experiencing the same thing. Some kind of lingering impression people leave behind, and even after nearly 20 years, the memory gives me full-body goosebumps. Story 29. When I was about 7 years old, I often saw pictures on frosty windows, not vague cloud shapes, but clear drawings with obvious subjects. And they were always pirate-themed, and the one I saw most often was a wrecked pirate ship on the bus window every frosty morning on my way to school. And once another kid even asked if I drew it, which told me other people could see it too. But things got stranger because I also saw frost drawings at home on a second-story window that nobody could reach. And the one there was a map stuck in sand with a dotted line leading to an X. And I remember showing it to my mom and asking if she saw it too. And she shrugged and said sometimes we all see pictures in frost, which I now know meant she saw nothing, but at the time I assumed it was normal. And for years I wondered how frost could draw such clear images until we moved away, and I never saw anything like it again. And when I was 18, my mom told me a rumor that the previous resident had supposedly buried treasure somewhere on the property before he died. And the only explanation I can come up with for why I kept seeing pirate drawings is that maybe he was somehow responsible in trying to tell me where it was. And although I know that sounds far-fetched, I still have no other explanation for any of it. Story 30. Growing up, we always joked that my house was haunted because random objects would fall and we would hear footsteps in the hallway. And we even named our supposed ghost Toby. And when I turned 21, I got a Siberian Husky for my birthday, named Rocco, who is still my baby 9 years later. And since my house is a bungalow, my dad had converted the attic into my bedroom when I was 12 and installed a temporary staircase that is still there, steep and narrow, and basically a nightmare to climb. And about a week after getting Rocco, I was asleep when I woke up to the sound of a dog running up to the head of my bed and scratching itself right beside my head, which terrified me because I thought my 10-week-old puppy had managed to climb those dangerous stairs alone from the kitchen where he should have been sleeping. But when I turned on the light, the room was empty. And when I went downstairs, Rocco was fast asleep in his bed. And the next morning when I told my brother what happened, he looked shocked and told me that the day before, he had been home alone with Rocco while the rest of the family was at work. And while he was in the sitting room and Rocco was in the kitchen, He heard loud dog footsteps coming up the hallway on the wooden floor, and trying to scare the dog, he opened the hall door and jumped out shouting, "Boo," only to find the hallway completely empty. And when he checked the kitchen, Rocco was again fast asleep. And every now and then something strange still happens, and we always say it is just Toby, our ghost dog.